From a man who never once told his own leader the truth, and it cost hundreds of thousands of men their lives, to a man who lost an argument with Hitler and let 800,000 men pay for it, to the general who executed his own soldiers for retreating, then deserted his own post when it mattered most. These are the 5 worst German generals of World War II, and number 1 on this list lost more men in 3 weeks than Germany lost at Stalingrad.
Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Said No. Wilhelm Keitel sits across the table from a field commander who is laying out in plain numbers why an order cannot be followed. Keitel already knows what he's going to tell Hitler. He knew before the meeting started. What was it about this man that made his own officers stop trusting him completely? As chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, Keitel's job was to give Hitler honest military advice. Other generals called him La Keitel, a play on the German word for lackey, because he never once gave Hitler advice Hitler didn't already want to hear. He signed the Commissar Order, authorizing the execution of captured Soviet political officers. He signed the Night and Fog Decree, allowing resistance fighters to vanish without trial, without record, without a grave. It gets worse. When field commanders brought Hitler honest battlefield assessments, Keitel often shut them down himself before Hitler even had to weigh in, protecting his Führer from ever hearing something he didn't want to hear. At Nuremberg, Keitel admitted under oath that he'd known some of the orders he signed were criminal. He signed them anyway. He was executed in 1946. He asked to be shot as a soldier instead of hanged like a common criminal. The court said no. Keitel gave Hitler certainty instead of truth. It cost other men their lives to find that out. He never once said no to Hitler. The next general on this list did argue with Hitler and lost, and 800,000 men paid for that lost argument. His name was Kurt Zeitzler. And this is what happened. If you're enjoying this, subscribe. New stories every week.
Chapter 2. The Argument He Lost. Kurt Zeitzler takes over as Chief of the Army General Staff in September 1942. Weeks later, the entire 6th Army is surrounded at Stalingrad. The map in front of him shows 2 Soviet armies closing from the north and south, and 1 narrow corridor still open. Zeitzler tells Hitler directly that the army needs to break out now, while it still can. So why is that army still sitting in that pocket 3 months later? Hermann Göring tells Hitler the Luftwaffe can resupply the trapped army entirely by air. Hitler believes him. Zeitzler argues against it, in person, more than once. Hitler overrules his own chief of the General Staff and orders the 6th Army to hold. But here's what nobody talks about. Zeitzler had won the argument on paper. He lost it in the room that mattered, and once Hitler's order was final, Zeitzler carried it out instead of forcing the issue further. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers stayed trapped inside that pocket. The airlift delivered only a fraction of what they needed to survive. Soldiers ate their horses. Then they ate nothing at all. By February 1943, close to 800,000 Axis soldiers were dead, wounded, or marched into Soviet captivity. Zeitzler kept arguing for realistic withdrawals through 1943 and 1944, and was dismissed in 1944 for still saying it. By then, it didn't matter to the men who died at Stalingrad. Zeitzler saw the disaster coming and said so, and it happened anyway. The next man on this list didn't need anyone to warn him. He simply refused to believe the weather could beat him. Chapter 3. The General Who Wouldn't Listen to Winter. Walther von Brauchitsch commands the entire German army as it crosses into the Soviet Union in June 1941. He has one job: win before winter. His panzer divisions move faster than any army in recorded history. What happens when that speed runs straight into a Russian December? Brauchitsch approved the invasion timeline without building in enough room for what every past invasion of Russia had already proven: that distance and cold kill armies faster than enemy soldiers do. Supply lines stretched past 1,000 miles. Soldiers stand in foxholes outside Moscow in November, still wearing summer uniforms. And then it got worse. Panzer engines freeze solid in the suburbs of Moscow. Rifle bolts jam shut in the cold. Brauchitsch had raised concerns before the invasion began. Once it started, he never pushed hard enough to change course while there was still time. When the advance stalls at Moscow's front door in December 1941, the stress of watching his own campaign collapse gives him a heart attack. Hitler fires him weeks later and takes personal command of the army himself, a decision historians consider one of the costliest command failures of the entire war. Brauchitsch froze under pressure, the same way his tanks froze in the snow. The next general on this list turned that same kind of pressure on his own men. Subscribe before we get to number 1. What he lost in 3 weeks makes Stalingrad look small. Chapter 4. The general who executed his own men. Ferdinand Schörner stands over a soldier accused of falling behind during a retreat, and he is about to give an order that will define his entire career. What kind of general builds his reputation on shooting the men under his own command? Schörner rose fast through the ranks on unconditional loyalty to Hitler. He became one of the most feared commanders in the Wehrmacht, not for tactical skill, but for what he did to his own troops, ordering summary executions for retreating, for straggling, for falling behind an impossible schedule. Historians estimate hundreds of his own soldiers were shot or hanged on his direct orders. Hitler trusted him completely because of it. But that wasn't even the worst part. In April 1945, with Berlin already surrounded and the war clearly lost, Hitler names Schörner commander-in-chief of the entire army. Schörner holds the position less than 2 weeks before deserting his own command and fleeing in civilian clothes as the front collapses around him. The soldiers he executed for doing exactly that were no longer alive to see it. He was convicted of war crimes twice. The Soviets sentenced him to 25 years, later reduced to 12.5, and released him in 1955. West Germany convicted him again in 1957, this time for manslaughter, over the executions of German soldiers, and sentenced him to 4.5 years. Schörner punished his own men for surviving. He never punished himself for doing the same. The last general on this list had every warning in the world laid out in front of him, and used none of it. Chapter 5. The fastest collapse of the war. Ernst Busch commands Army Group Center in June 1944, and Soviet troop buildups have been visible along his front for weeks. His own field commanders are begging him for permission to pull back to defensible ground. What does he tell them? He tells them, no. Hitler's standing order is to hold every position without exception, and Busch passes that order down the line without pushing back once. What followed was worse than anything his staff expected. Operation Bagration hits his front on June 22, 1944, and the Red Army breaks through within the first 2 days. 28 German divisions are destroyed or trapped inside 3 weeks. Nearly 400,000 German soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. More men lost in less time than at Stalingrad. Busch is relieved of command within the month, one of the few generals fired by Hitler for an outcome Hitler's own orders had guaranteed. He never holds another major command for the rest of the war. Army Group Center never exists again either. 5 generals, 5 different ways of losing men and ground that didn't have to be lost. Keitel gave Hitler agreement instead of honesty. Zeitzler won the argument and lost the war anyway. Brauchitsch froze while his army froze around him. Schörner executed his own soldiers for the exact failure he later committed himself. Busch had every warning available and acted on none of it. Not one of these men was beaten by a smarter enemy. Every one of them was beaten by his own decisions first. Subscribe for more videos like this.